So let's talk about what the global media is grappling with today. And we have got Brazil's top-selling paper, Folha de Sao Paulo, and it has extensive coverage, of course, of that inauguration of the country's new leader, Jair Bolsonaro. The president's saying it's time for Brazil to free itself from socialism. The Financial Times takes a closer look at the recent trade and market turmoil. In the commentary section, Martin Wolf argues that the future might not belong to China, and in fact, India may take the global economic lead. The UK's Independent has a picture of the New Horizons probe team high-fiving each other. The celebrations kicked off after it was confirmed the space probe had successfully completed a fly-past of the icy rock Ultima Thule. And then Mumbai's Business Standard has an important mental health story. It claims Facebook has been quietly alerting police if one of its users makes a suicidal post. It comes on the heels of criticism of the company for not doing enough to help those in need. And then finally, social media went into a bit of a frenzy. According to the South China Morning Post, the paper says Cathay Pacific may have had a technical glitch, which meant that it sold first-class seats for economy prices. So bargain hunters were picking up fares 7 and 10 times lower than normal. That's the great technical glitch for consumers. We've got Stephanie Hare back with us as promised. So Stephanie, let's get started. So Folha de Sao Paulo, the most read newspaper in Brazil, talking about Jair Bolsonaro and his inaugural speech. He had a lot to say. Yep. Give us your take on their coverage of this.
Well, it's really interesting because this is somebody who's been likened to Donald Trump for Brazil. And what's fascinating is that the United States and Brazil haven't always had great relations in the past, I'd say, 20 years. So we could see something really new emerging between the relationships between those two countries and how that's going to change relations with the other South American, Latin American countries. So we've got a humanitarian crisis in Venezuela. There's going to be relations with Cuba. So this is something that we want to keep an eye on in terms of the international relations perspective. We also know that he's got to prepare pension reform. He's fighting corruption. And this is somebody who was elected in October, so it's still very early days to predict what's going to happen, but that's sort of the big cards he's laying out.
And many would argue that he's compared to Trump because he's seen as a very divisive figure, and yet he got this, democratic, he was democratically elected, which is a point he made in his speech over and over again. And this is something that they point out in their coverage of his speech. He says, the Brazilian people democratically chose me. Therefore, I can crack on with my agenda, as you say, corruption, pension reform. But there are concerns about his own core beliefs, about things like homosexual people, women, all sorts of key issues.
And indeed also the environment, which in this age of climate change and all sorts of disasters that are happening around the planet is really concerning because, of course, Brazil hosts the Amazon rainforest, which is one of the most important in the world for regulating the planet.
He's got some quite interesting ideas about what to do with that as well, hasn't he? Which is quite worrying for those who watch the environment. Yeah. But as you say, really interesting about his relationship perhaps with the United States in the future. I mean, this just on the day when we're hearing about, tear gas being thrown over the border between the US and Colombia because of the concern about, people trying to pour into the United States coming partly from Venezuela.
Yes, so it's really interesting because I think the way that we deal with refugees and asylum seekers really dates from the Second World War, and we haven't come up with a policy that really works for the crises that are facing different countries today. And the US-Mexico border is one of those real flashpoints.
So it's one to watch, as you say, really interesting. Let's now move on to this story in the Financial Times, which is sort of in the commentary section. It's Martin Wolf, the economist, giving us his take on where we are headed. And as I was reading this, I was reminded of the fact that I love this time of year because I do love reading the analysis coming from top economists, from leading investment banks, their thoughts on the year ahead. And this is a really interesting read, isn't it?
Yes. Right now, he makes a really interesting point saying that back in the 1980s, Japan was seen as the country that was going to be the #1 economy in the world. Of course, that hasn't happened. It's still very strong. Now we're looking at saying the future might belong to China. He's questioning that, and he questions that on a few grounds, one of which is he questions the fundamental economic model within China, but then he opposes it and says things like robotics and artificial intelligence could see the United States unleash a new era of growth. And India, which is of course starting from a lower base than China, has the potential to grow 5 to 7% for the next sort of what I think he says 10, 20 years, till 2040. So he compares it.
He compares it, but he also talks about the leadership as well. You know, President Xi, we've got a picture of President Xi there. There's a picture of Narendra Modi there, or cartoons, should I say. You know, talking about the men in charge as well, and what a significant element that is in terms of how these economies, these countries are led.
Yes, policy is so important. And again, I think it's really interesting that this Martin Wolf column, which is so sharp, doesn't mention the environment. And these are both countries that have really, you know, quite high air pollution, really big populations and pressing demographic issues. He sort of hints at that. So I think there's a lot more. I'd love to see him develop that over the course of this year. I'm
sure he will. I'm sure he absolutely will. Now, let's talk about Alice Bowman, who is Mission Ops Manager at NASA, and she's high-fiving a colleague because they did this flight